He called to fire the cleaning lady until a child's voice answered. "Mommy's really sick," she whispered. That one sentence shattered billionaire CEO Alexander's perfect world. What began as a cold business decision turned into the most important promise of his life, in the family he never knew he needed. Before we begin, leave a comment below and let us know where you are watching from so we can say hello. Now let's get into the story. Alexander is only 40 years old, but he has built an empire from scratch, a child of the foster system and the streets of Chicago's South Side, who has worked his way into the upper echelons of American business, turning a single real estate deal into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. Now his name glitters in silver letters atop the city's tallest skyscraper, Alex Global. Each morning, Alexander arrived at his office precisely at 7:30 a.m. Never a minute late, never disheveled. Dressed in an immaculately tailored navy suit, his shoes polished to a mirror finish, he cut the image of a man who was in total command of his world. His office, spacious, sterile, and drenched in cold natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooked the city like a throne over a conquered kingdom. He liked it that way, controlled, predictable, powerful. To most, Alexander was the American dream personified, wealthy, brilliant, untouchable. But beneath that perfectly curated exterior was something else entirely: emptiness. He hadn't laughed in months. He hadn't shared a meal that wasn't on his calendar. He hadn't held a meaningful conversation with anyone outside of business since his father figure in the foster system passed away. And yet he carried on, believing, perhaps even convincing himself that success was enough. Every corner of his life was polished and pristine, from his penthouse apartment to the espresso in his hand. But inside, Alexander was hollowed by years of relentless ambition. There were no photos on his desk, no children, no partner, just numbers, projections, deadlines. Alexander sat behind his polished mahogany desk, the glow of his triple monitor setup reflecting off the glass walls of his office. He was deeply focused, red penning a line graph in a quarterly forecast report, making surgical corrections only someone of his precision could detect. The city of Chicago sprawled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely glanced at it. His world, for now, was numbers, clean, predictable, under control. He didn't hear the door open, but he sensed the shift in atmosphere, a hesitation, a presence. Alexander looked up slowly, and there was Julia, his new assistant, standing stiffly near the edge of the desk, clutching a small tablet to his chest like a shield. Alexander arched an eyebrow. "Sir," Julia began, his voice small, unsure. "I apologize for the interruption, but I thought you'd want to know. Mrs. Linda Reyes, the cleaning staff assigned to this floor, hasn't come in again today. It's the second day." Alexander's jaw tensed. This was not the moment for trivia, not while finalizing a $400 million acquisition proposal. Still, a part of him, trained for efficiency, clicked into place. Absences led to sloppiness. Sloppiness led to decline. "She didn't call in?" he asked curtly. "No, sir," Julia replied, shifting from foot to foot. There was a pause. Alexander closed the forecast folder with a soft but decisive click, irritation flickering behind his eyes. "Get me her number," he said at last. Julia nodded quickly, relief and anxiety mingling on his face as he tapped on his tablet. Alexander didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The disruption had already planted something, unease that Alexander couldn't yet name. Alexander didn't usually make phone calls like this. He had people for that. Assistants, department heads, protocols, layers designed to protect his time, his focus, his carefully constructed world. But something about the way Julia had hesitated in the doorway lingered with him. Linda Reyes wasn't just absent. She had vanished without a word. And Alexander, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, decided to make the call himself. He sat straighter in his leather chair, the skyline glittering behind him like a badge of his dominance. He stared at the slip of paper Julia had handed him, 10 digits written in a neat looping script. He tapped the number into the keypad, each beep oddly loud in the quiet of his office. The phone rang once, then twice. He adjusted his cuffs, mentally preparing the script. "This is Alexander." I'm calling because you failed to report to work for 2 consecutive days. I expect an explanation. If you're unable to meet the standards of this company, your contract will be terminated. Firm, impersonal, precise. 3 rings. 4. He felt a flicker of annoyance. This was already taking longer than it should. He was about to end the call when click, the line connected. And then, hello? The voice was not what he expected. It wasn't the weary sigh of an overworked adult. It wasn't defensive, apologetic, or even hurried. It was soft, high-pitched, tentative, a child's voice. Alexander froze. He blinked at the city stretched out before him, but saw none of it. That single word, barely more than a breath, had cut through his mental armor like a whisper through glass. For a moment, he thought he must have misdialed, but he hadn't. The number matched. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words ready. Everything he'd rehearsed evaporated like fog in sunlight. Hello? The voice repeated, a little more uncertain this time. Alexander swallowed, the sharp edge of command suddenly dulled. Hi, he managed, his voice catching slightly. Is your mother home? There was a pause long enough that he imagined her holding the phone in both hands, wondering if she'd done something wrong. Then came the answer. A whisper too small for this towering world of glass and steel he lived in. Mom is very sick, said the little girl. 4 words. 4 tiny words that fell like bricks into the silence that followed. They hit Alexander harder than any business negotiation ever had. His throat went dry. The voice belonged to a child, fragile, unsure, maybe scared, but trying so hard to be brave. And just like that, every assumption he'd made about irresponsibility, neglect, professionalism, collapsed. He swallowed hard, adjusting his posture without realizing he'd leaned forward. Who am I speaking with? He asked, gentler now. Ava, she said. I'm 8 years old, alone in the apartment with her mother too sick to speak. And is someone else there with you, Ava? He asked, his voice tight now for an entirely different reason. My brother Jamie, she said. He's 3. He's playing with his dinosaur. Mommy said to be quiet, but he doesn't listen. Alexander closed his eyes. A toddler. A baby and a child were alone in that apartment. He had expected an excuse, maybe even denial, but not this. I see, he said slowly. Is your mom? Is she okay? She can't get out of bed, Ava said quietly. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. I made toast, but I burned it. She still smiled, though. That did it. Alexander felt something twist sharply in his chest, an emotion he couldn't identify. It wasn't pity. It wasn't guilt. It was something deeper, older. A part of him, long buried beneath deadlines and boardroom presentations, had just stirred awake. He couldn't picture Ava's face, but he could imagine her small hands struggling to hold a spatula, her trying to care for her little brother, while her mother lay sick in the next room. Thank you for telling me, Ava, he managed, barely trusting his voice. You're very brave. There was a small silence between them, and Ava asked softly, Who are you, sir? I'm the boss of your mother's workplace. They told me she hasn't been here in 2 days. Alexander said, Are you going to fire her? Alexander stared at the phone in his hand as if it had turned to stone. No, he said firmly. No, honey, I'm going to help her. And in that moment, everything changed. Alexander gripped the phone a little tighter, the smooth surface suddenly slick against his palm. He had expected excuses, maybe silence, but not this. Not the small, trembling voice of a child who sounded far too grown for her age. My mommy can't get up, the little girl repeated softly. Then, as if gathering every ounce of courage she had, she added, But I can come clean. I know where the supplies are. I can do it if you really need someone. There was a silence so heavy that it rang in Alexander's ears. He stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the skyline anymore. He was seeing the mental image her words painted. A little girl, barely 8, standing on her tiptoes to reach the cabinet beneath the kitchen sink, dragging out a mop that was taller than her, maybe tying her curls back with a rubber band, pretending she knew what she was doing. "Ava," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. It startled him. He never let emotion show, especially not in his tone. He cleared his throat, trying again, this time gentler. "That's very brave of you, sweetheart, but that's not something you need to do." "But we need money," she whispered. Alexander stiffened. It was as if something had pierced his armor for decades. All the mergers, the meetings, the quarterly goals, none of them had ever hit him like this. He'd spent his life believing that performance justified everything. Missing one shift meant negligence. Missing two shifts meant being fired. End of story. But now that story has a voice with a name. "Ava," he said again more slowly, "how is your mother now?" "She was coughing a lot. She said her chest hurt," she replied. "She told me to stay in the house and keep an eye on Jamie." A lump formed in his throat. Alexander leaned back in his chair and rubbed a hand down his face. A wave of something unfamiliar swelled inside him, settling like a stone in his chest. Shame. He had been about to fire their mother. A decision made in less than a minute. No second thought. Just a number on a list. But now that number had a voice. Two, actually. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't even sure if she could understand how much that meant. "You don't need to clean, Ava. Not you, not your mom, not right now. Just take care of Jamie, okay?" "Okay," she murmured, and though her voice was still soft, he thought he heard something else this time. Relief. Ava hung up the phone. The soft click echoed louder in Alexander's ear than any boardroom gavel or closing bell he had ever heard. He stared at the receiver, still cradled in his hand, and then slowly lowered it back onto the cradle like it was made of glass. For a long time, he didn't move. The sleek glass office that usually made him feel invincible now felt too bright, too still, too sterile. He sat there, shoulders heavy, the silence pressing into his chest. The voice of the little girl, Ava, still rang in his ears. Just 8 years old and already carrying more fear and responsibility than some adults ever would. And then there were her words, "But we need money." As if poverty had trained her to be brave, fast, and apologetic all at once. And her offer, offhand and heartbreakingly serious, "I can come clean if mommy can't." Alexander tried to picture it, a child in a faded dress, wiping down windows, standing on tiptoes to reach sinks and counters, her small fingers fumbling with mops too tall for her. And then, as if the weight of the image wasn't already unbearable, another flashed into his mind, one she hadn't even mentioned. A little boy, Ava's brother, Jamie, just 3 years old. Likely sitting close by during that call, maybe clinging to his sister's side or tugging at her sleeve, unaware of the adult conversation that determined their survival. Alexander clenched his jaw and leaned back in his chair, staring out at the skyline that had always reminded him of power and control. But right now, the towering buildings looked distant and hollow. What was the point of ruling the city if he didn't even know what was happening in the shadows of its streets? He'd built an empire on structure, on precision, on predictability. He had believed that success came from never getting personally involved, never letting emotion cloud judgment, never making decisions out of sympathy. But this wasn't sympathy. This was something deeper, guilt, shame, and something else he couldn't name, a pull he hadn't felt in years. He looked down at his calendar, neatly packed with meetings, deals, and obligations, pages of commitments that once made him feel important. Now they looked meaningless. He reached for the intercom and pressed the button. "Julia," he said, his voice low but steady. His assistant's voice crackled through. "Yes, sir?" "Cancel everything for the day, all of it. Push my meetings, reschedule the board prep. Tell legal I'll get back to them tomorrow." There was a long pause. "All of it, sir?" "Yes." Alexander didn't wait for questions. He let go of the button and stood. This was unprecedented. He hadn't missed a full day since the company went public. But today, none of it mattered. Not the deals, not the status, not the image. Today, a little girl had picked up the phone instead of her sick mother. Today, a child offered to clean an office in exchange for survival. Today, something inside him broke, and something else, just maybe, began to heal. And he couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. Alexander didn't remember the last time he drove himself anywhere. The steering wheel felt unfamiliar beneath his hands, like a relic from a life he'd carefully edited out. His company car had always waited downstairs, spotless and ready. His assistant usually mapped out his routes, managing time like a battlefield general. But today, none of that felt right. No driver, no schedule. Just a name, an address scribbled on a post-it, and a feeling in his chest that refused to be ignored. He drove west, past the glittering corporate towers, past the safe, tree-lined neighborhoods his real estate empire had helped redesign, until the city began to change. The buildings grew older, smaller. Windows were covered with plastic instead of glass. Sidewalks buckled from years of neglect. He passed a shuttered laundromat, a liquor store with bars on the windows, and a playground where rusted swings creaked in the wind. And then he saw it, the narrow red brick building. Paint peeled around the windows. A satellite dish dangled from the roof. The number on the mailbox had been scratched off. Alexander parked at the curb and just sat there. It was one thing to care. It was another to step inside a world he had spent years insulating himself from. This was the life he'd worked so hard to rise above. Every dollar, every sleepless night, every ruthless decision had been made to make sure he'd never belong to a place like this. And yet here he was, hands still gripping the steering wheel, like he didn't quite know what to do next. He climbed out and shut the door behind him. The wind carried the sharp scent of exhaust and something sweet but spoiled. As he approached the stoop, a small plastic toy lay forgotten on the cracked concrete, its pink wheels scuffed and one axle missing. A child's toy. It made his chest ache. Inside, the hallway light flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows against stained walls. The carpet was thin, frayed, and smelled faintly of damp clothes and overcooked rice. Every few feet, a door stood slightly ajar, revealing slivers of other lives, muffled cartoons, coughing, the clatter of dishes. He checked the door numbers. None were clear. Some were handwritten in permanent marker. He stopped in front of the one that matched the address and hesitated, unsure for the first time in years how to announce himself. Before he could knock, he heard the soft sound of laughter, childish, light. A small boy's giggle, followed by a girl's gentle, shh. His heart jumped. That was Ava, and that must have been Jamie, her little brother. He stood frozen, hand hovering in the air. He had come expecting silence, maybe resistance, but instead there was a child's laughter on the other side of the door, and it shook him more than any confrontation ever could. He took a breath and knocked. The door creaked open just a few inches at first. Alexander, still dressed in his pristine navy suit, stood silently in the dim hallway, his polished shoes scuffed now from the uneven concrete steps. He had spent his entire career walking into boardrooms with unshakable confidence. But here, outside this narrow apartment in a forgotten corner of the city, his heart beat like it hadn't in years. Then he saw her, Ava. She was small, far smaller than she had sounded on the phone. Barely 8, with pale skin and blonde curls that had lost their bounce, tied back by a faded headband. She wore a pink dress, clearly worn thin in places, with a little bow at the collar that had come slightly undone. The dress looked like it had once been someone's favorite, maybe hers, but time and too many washes had drained it of color. Still, she stood there, framed by the chipped doorway, with a quiet strength that made Alexander's chest ache. Her blue eyes studied him, cautious but not fearful. She tilted her head just slightly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Are you the man from Mommy's work?" Alexander felt his throat tighten. He could have given her his title, reminded her he was the CEO of one of the largest companies in the city, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He just nodded. Ava looked over her shoulder for a second, as if expecting someone to stop her. No sound came from inside. Then, with a quiet resolve that shook him more than any boardroom confrontation ever had, she stepped back and opened the door wider. You can come in, she said softly. He stepped inside slowly, ducking his head slightly, as if not to disturb the fragile peace of the place. The air was warm and carried the faint scent of old tea and something floral, maybe detergent or perfume. The apartment was tiny but clean. Too clean, he thought, for someone so sick. Every surface had been wiped, a small vase with a wilting flower set on the windowsill. In the corner, on a sagging second-hand couch, he saw a woman, Linda Reyes, propped up by several pillows, her skin pale and her features drawn tight with pain. But before he could take another step, a small noise stopped him. A boy, barely more than a toddler, peered out from behind a worn armchair. He had the same wide blue eyes as Ava, the same pale skin, and a blanket clutched in one tiny fist. He couldn't have been more than 3. "That's Jamie," Ava said, following Alexander's gaze. "He's my little brother." Jamie blinked up at Alexander, then shuffled forward until he was pressed against Ava's side, one chubby hand clutching the edge of her dress. Alexander crouched slightly, his knees creaking in a way he never noticed until now. He offered a faint smile. "Hi, Jamie," he said. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't run either. Ava rested her hand gently on her brother's head, as if protecting him with her presence alone. And Alexander realized she had been protecting all of this alone for longer than any child should have to. Alexander's eyes then turned to the woman lying under the thin blanket on the sofa. Linda Reyes. Her name had once been just an entry on a spreadsheet, someone he'd never met, never expected to meet. But now she was here, thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes and lips that had lost their color. Her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her body looked impossibly small beneath the old sheets. She looked up and locked eyes with him and froze. "Mr. Alex?" she whispered, struggling to sit up, wincing as pain rippled through her body. Alexander stepped forward quickly, holding up a hand. "Please, don't get up." Linda let out a breathless laugh, part surprise, part disbelief. I didn't expect. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, sir." Her words hit him like a punch. She thought she'd caused trouble. That missing 2 days of work while battling what looked like a serious illness was a failure. That needing help meant she was a burden. "You haven't caused any trouble, Linda," he said gently, his voice lower, softer than it had been in years. "You're sick. That's not a crime." Her eyes welled, and she turned her face slightly toward the wall, ashamed of the tears she couldn't stop. Ava climbed up beside her mother and curled into her side, her little arms protectively wrapping around Linda's waist. Jamie toddled forward now and climbed onto the floor by the couch, laying his head against Linda's knee without saying a word. Alexander stood there, surrounded by worn furniture, cracked wallpaper, and a family just trying to hold on. The air smelled faintly of menthol and chamomile, and the room, though small, was spotless. Despite her condition, Linda had clearly tried to keep things in order. And somehow, in this cramped apartment, Alexander felt smaller than he ever had in his sprawling penthouse. He had come here expecting to fix a problem. Instead, he had walked straight into a life. Alexander sat down slowly beside the couch, the polished CEO now nothing more than a man in a wrinkled suit. The soft creak of the old chair under him felt jarringly loud in the quiet apartment. He shifted slightly, not from discomfort, but from something heavier, something pressing down on his chest. He'd stood at the top of boardrooms and addressed thousands. He'd negotiated mergers worth millions without blinking. But here, in this dimly lit room, beside a sick woman and 2 small children, he felt utterly helpless. Linda lay pale and still, her breathing shallow, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. The floral blanket covering her looked thin against the chill air seeping through the cracked window. Ava sat silently at her mother's side, her small hand resting protectively on the edge of the couch. Her blonde curls slightly tangled, her dress wrinkled but clean. There was something about her stillness, so careful, so watchful, that unnerved him. A child that young shouldn't look like she was carrying the weight of a household. Alexander turned slightly as a soft shuffle caught his attention, From behind a curtain, a tiny figure peeked out. Ava's younger brother, Jamie. The little boy, barely 3, held a worn stuffed bunny in one arm and sucked his thumb quietly as he stared at the stranger in their home. His round eyes mirrored Ava's, wide, uncertain, and tired. Alexander offered a faint, unsure smile. Jamie didn't return it, but he didn't retreat either. That somehow felt like trust. Ava's gaze didn't leave him. Those blue eyes, impossibly large for her small face, were full of something he couldn't name. Hope, maybe. Fear. Expectation. He wasn't sure. All he knew was that they pierced straight through the layers he'd built over decades. Ambition, control, distance. She looked at him like he was supposed to fix everything, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how. I didn't know it was this bad, he said, his voice cracking slightly despite the effort to keep it steady. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Linda, who was too weak to respond, or to Ava or to himself. Ava didn't respond either. She simply nodded once like she understood more than he ever wanted a child to understand. Alexander exhaled slowly. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft hum of the fridge and Jamie's occasional sniffle. He didn't know what to say, but something inside him refused to stand and walk out that door. Not now. Not after what he had seen. Not after hearing Ava's voice on the phone, offering to clean his office because her mother couldn't stand. He looked at Ava again, her eyes still locked on his. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally, his voice low but certain. She didn't smile, not really, but her shoulders relaxed, just barely. And in that single moment, more powerful than any contract he'd ever signed, Alexander knew this wasn't just charity. It was a beginning. Linda had managed to sit up straight now as Alexander took the old chair beside her bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. The gray afternoon light filtered through the cracked curtains, illuminating the faded color of her cheeks and the way her hands trembled slightly under the covers. She looked exhausted, far more than Alexander had anticipated. Her voice, when it came, was little more than a thread. "I thought," she began, eyes fixed on the quilt at her waist, "that if I just rested a couple of days, it would be enough. Just enough to get back to work before anyone noticed I was gone." Her fingers gripped the blanket like she was trying to hold herself together. She took a slow, shaky breath, then continued, "But I can't even stand for more than a minute now. Every time I try, it feels like my legs won't remember how." Alexander said nothing at first. He sat with his hands clasped in his lap, his tailored suit crumpling in a way that would have driven him mad a week ago. Now it didn't even register. He was focused only on her, on the woman he had nearly fired without asking a single question. Linda's voice cracked as she went on. "I was afraid that if I didn't go in, I'd lose the job. And if I lost the job, I don't know what would happen to Ava, or to Jamie." At the sound of the little boy's name, Alexander turned his head toward the small bedroom off the main room. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside came the soft rustling of a blanket and the faint hum of a lullaby. Ava's voice, gentle and rhythmic, singing her 3-year-old brother to sleep. He swallowed hard. Linda followed his gaze, her eyes clouding with guilt. "He's been sick too," she said softly. "Just a cold, I think, but I can't take him to a doctor. We haven't had health insurance in months." Her voice caught again. "I haven't told Ava everything, but she's smart. She knows more than she should. She's the one who figured out how to stretch a box of pasta across 2 nights. She even taught herself to use the stove when I couldn't get out of bed." Alexander's throat felt tight. In the boardrooms where he thrived, numbers spoke louder than people. But here in this cramped apartment with its peeling pain and quiet desperation, the numbers meant nothing. "She shouldn't have to know any of that," he said quietly, the weight of it hitting him all at once. Linda nodded. "I know, but she does. And now Jamie's starting to notice too. This morning he asked me if we were out of milk again. He's 3. He shouldn't even know what that means." Her voice broke completely then, and she turned her face away, ashamed of the tears that began to fall despite her efforts to blink them back. Alexander leaned forward. "Linda!" She didn't look at him. I mean it, he said more firmly. You're not going to lose your job. You're not going to lose Ava or Jamie. You're going to have the time you need to get better. I'll make sure of that. She shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but disbelief. I don't want pity, and I don't want special treatment just because you found out. He understood that. He respected it even. But he also wasn't going to let pride cost her everything. It's not pity, he said, choosing his words carefully. It's responsibility. Mine. For not knowing sooner. For almost punishing you for being sick. For forgetting that people have lives outside of work. That made her look at him. Her eyes were rimmed red, her cheeks damp, but there was something fierce beneath the fatigue. Something maternal and unbreakable. I didn't want Ava to answer the phone, she whispered, but I couldn't get up, and she told me she'd handle it. Alexander nodded slowly. She did more than handle it. She broke up with me in a way no one else ever has. Linda managed a weak smile, though it was shaky. She said you were nice. I wasn't sure she was talking about the same man who runs a multi-billion-dollar company. Alexander let out a breath that was half laugh, half confessional. I wasn't sure, until she picked up the phone. He sat there and looked at each of them, and said in a firm voice, You don't have to worry anymore. You won't have to choose between your health and your job, ever. Jamie yawned and leaned back on his mother's shoulder, eyes downcast. Ava looked at Alexander with eyes that were no longer wary, but wide, trusting. Linda blinked at him through tears. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, he said. You've already given more than you should ever have had to. And for the first time, she didn't protest. In that moment, Alexander knew. This wasn't charity. This wasn't guilt. It was a promise. Alexander left the Reyes apartment hours later, but the image of Ava clutching her mother's frail hand refused to leave his mind. It stayed with him like an imprint burned into the back of his eyes. Her small fingers curled protectively around Linda's, her wide blue eyes filled with a worry that no child should ever have to carry. And now he couldn't shake the image of the little boy too. Jamie, her younger brother, just 3 years old, curled up asleep on the edge of the couch, his tiny body pressed against a faded stuffed bear missing one eye. Alexander had barely noticed Jamie at first, hidden beneath a pile of folded blankets in the corner. But just before he left, the child had stirred, rubbing his eyes with the back of a chubby hand and sitting up groggily, blinking at him like he wasn't sure if Alexander was real. Ava had rushed to her brother's side, brushing the curls from his forehead and whispering gently to him, It's okay, Jamie. He's a good man. Those 5 words had hit Alexander harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. He walked slowly down the narrow apartment stairwell, hand trailing lightly along the chipped railing. The hallway smelled of boiled rice and old laundry detergent. His polished shoes echoed too loudly in the silence. And still, the weight in his chest refused to lift. He had once believed that success meant never looking back, that life was about pushing forward, building higher, faster, cleaner. But that small living room, with its cluttered shelf of worn books, the warm scent of mint tea, and a child's crayon drawings taped to the wall, it had something his penthouse never did. Heart. By the time he reached his car, parked between 2 rusted sedans on a cracked curb, he wasn't the man who had stepped out of it just a few hours earlier. The version of Alexander who had called Linda Reyes expecting to fire her for being absent. That man felt like a stranger now. This version, the one who sat silently behind the wheel with his hands resting on the steering wheel long after the engine started, was different. He didn't drive away immediately. He couldn't. He sat there watching the building, half expecting Ava to appear in the window, holding Jamie in her arms and waving. But there was no movement, just the stillness of twilight settling over a part of the city he had never cared to know until today. His phone buzzed. Messages, emails, meetings, all the things that had once defined his life. But tonight, none of it mattered. He unlocked the screen and stared at his calendar. There were 6 meetings tomorrow, 2 of them critical. A dinner with investors, a press interview, things that would have felt monumental only a day before. Now, they felt distant, weightless. He closed the phone. The silence in the car was both comforting and crushing. For the first time in years, he was aware of how little noise his life truly made when he wasn't surrounded by people who needed something from him. The thought made his throat tighten. He could still see Linda's face, pale and tired, trying to sit up straighter when she noticed Jamie waking. Her eyes had flicked between her two children and Alexander, with something between embarrassment and quiet pleading. Pleading not for help, but for dignity. And Ava, she hadn't let go of her mother's hand once. What kind of world expected children like her to be brave like that? What kind of man had he become that he didn't even question it until now? Alexander looked at his reflection in the dark window. The sharp blue suit, the cufflinks, the expensive haircut, all the things that screamed success, all the things that suddenly felt like armor he no longer wanted to wear. The truth sat heavily in his gut. He didn't want to go back to the penthouse tonight, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. No voices, no laughter, no small hands reaching for his fingers, no quiet bravery, no Ava, no Jamie, no Linda. He didn't belong in that glossy silence anymore. He belonged here, or at least he wanted to. Not just to help, but to stay, to return, to be part of something that mattered. He had built an empire from nothing. But for the first time, he wondered if he'd been building in the wrong direction all along. The sky deepened to a navy hue, the city's lights flickering on like stars in the wrong hemisphere. He rolled down the window slightly, letting in the cool summer breeze, hoping it might clear the fog from his thoughts. But all it did was bring the scent of the neighborhood back to him: fried onions, laundry soap, car oil, and the faint smell of honeysuckle growing wild along the side of the building. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. Ava's voice echoed in his memory again. He's a good man. Was he? He wasn't sure. Not yet, but he wanted to be. For her, for Jamie, for Linda, for himself. He sat there a long time unmoving before finally turning the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, but he didn't turn toward the expressway. Instead, he drove the long way home, past parks he'd never noticed, through neighborhoods that pulsed with life far messier and far more real than anything his penthouse could offer. When he finally reached the lobby of his building, he paused before getting out. His phone buzzed again. This time he ignored it, because tonight his mind wasn't on stocks or strategy. It was on a little girl who had whispered, "We need money," with more courage than most men he knew. It was on a 3-year-old boy clutching a bear missing an eye. It was on a woman too sick to speak, but still trying to smile for her children. And it was on a quiet promise forming in the space between one breath and the next. He would go back, not because he had to, because he wanted to, and because, for the first time in a very long time, he had found a place where he wanted to belong. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of Alexander's penthouse, casting soft gold across the kitchen's gleaming countertops. The espresso machine hummed in the background, but his coffee sat untouched, cooling slowly as he stared blankly at his phone. His schedule, once the sacred framework of his empire, lay beside it, ignored. It had been less than 24 hours since he stood in that dim apartment, his heart twisted by the frailty of Linda Reyes and the quiet courage of her daughter, Ava. And now, with sleep-deprived eyes and a mind full of questions he wasn't used to asking himself, Alexander was already drafting a plan, one not born out of strategy or return on investment, but something far messier and more human. He'd been up since dawn. He had called his personal assistant by 6:15 a.m., issuing 3 clear instructions: contact a home nurse agency, arrange for a week's worth of groceries to be delivered to the Reyes apartment, and prepare a direct deposit bonus to Linda's account large enough to cover her missed wages and more. No explanation. Just make it happen. By 7 a.m., he was on the phone with Margaret Ellison, his legal advisor of nearly 15 years, a woman he trusted more than most people in his life. Margaret answered on the first ring, her voice crisp as always. "Morning, Alexander. You're up early." "I need your help," he said, skipping pleasantries. He explained everything in a steady tone: the sick employee he'd never noticed before, the unexpected phone call, the little girl who answered instead, and the visit that changed everything. He described Ava's two old eyes and her two small hands holding his sleeve, and the way Linda had apologized for being too sick to stand. He even mentioned the small boy, Jamie, barely 3, asleep on the couch with a faded blanket clutched in his fist, oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding around him. Alexander didn't embellish, but he didn't downplay either. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. He imagined Margaret at her glass desk, pushing her reading glasses higher on her nose, trying to find the exact right words. "Alexander," she said at last, gently but firmly, "this isn't your responsibility." He rubbed his forehead, fingers pressing into the tension that hadn't left his skull since the call with Ava. He knew what she meant. Legally, ethically, even professionally, he didn't owe the Reyes family anything. And yet, "I know it's not," he said quietly, staring at the untouched coffee. "But it feels like it is." Another pause, but this time softer. "Okay," she said finally, "then we'll make sure everything is arranged properly. Just tell me what you need." After hanging up, Alexander exhaled deeply, then packed 2 large canvas bags himself. He didn't want a driver. He didn't want staff. No one else could carry this weight. Inside the bags, he placed cartons of milk, fresh fruit, bread, eggs, soft cereal bars, juice boxes, medicine, and a small box of crayons and coloring books, items his assistant had suggested. But it was Alexander who had added a small stuffed elephant for Jamie, something soft and new. He hadn't held a stuffed toy in his hands in over 3 decades, but something about the boy's stillness on that couch haunted him. No child should have to grow up feeling invisible. The drive back to the apartment was quiet. He parked on the street again, ignoring the fact that the curb was cracked and uneven, the sort of thing he would have once complained about at a board meeting if it were near one of his luxury properties. He rang the buzzer. Ava answered the door, this time with a little more color in her cheeks. Her pink dress had been swapped for an oversized t-shirt with cartoon stars, and her blonde curls were pulled into a high ponytail that bounced when she moved. "You came back," she said, like she'd held her breath all morning. "I told you I would," Alexander replied with a smile, holding up the bags. "Think you can help me carry some of this?" She nodded quickly, grabbing a bag with both hands and walking backward to clear space. "Jamie's still sleeping," she whispered. "Mommy's awake, but she's tired again." Alexander stepped inside and instantly felt the warmth of the place. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and vanilla. On the couch, little Jamie lay curled up under the same faded blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. His thumb rested against his cheek. Alexander's heart clenched at the sight. Linda Reyes was propped up slightly more than yesterday. Her skin was still pale, but her eyes opened wider when she saw him. "Mr. Alex," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "Just Alexander," he said gently, placing the groceries on the counter and walking over. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted. She looked at him with gratitude and disbelief, her lips trembling. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he replied, pulling the chair close. "This isn't about gratitude. It's about what's right." Behind him, Ava began unpacking the groceries carefully, sorting the boxes and cans by category, as if this was her normal routine. But when she found the coloring books, her eyes lit up, and she turned to him. "For me?" she asked, astonished. "And for Jamie," he said, pulling out the little elephant and handing it to her. She took it gently, like it was something rare and magical. "He's gonna love this." Alexander watched her set the elephant beside her sleeping brother and tuck the blanket closer to his shoulder. The tenderness in her actions pierced something deep in him. This little girl had been playing protector, provider, and peacemaker all at once, and she was only 8. He turned back to Linda, who had tears pooling in her eyes again. "I'll have a nurse visit tomorrow," he told her, voice steady, "and I've sent in advance to cover the weeks ahead. I want you to focus on resting and getting better." She tried to protest, but her voice cracked. Ava looked up sharply and took her mother's hand. "It's okay, Mommy," she said. "He said it's not charity." Alexander nodded. "It's not. It's what anyone with the ability should do." Linda closed her eyes for a moment, overcome, and for a long while no one spoke. The refrigerator hummed, a car honked distantly outside, and in that quiet space something stronger than obligation filled the room. An understanding, a connection, a decision. Alexander wasn't there because he had to be. He was there because somewhere between the polished floors of his office tower and this small, fragile home, he had discovered something far more valuable than control. He had found meaning. Alexander returned to the Reyes apartment again and again, not because he had to, not because it was expected, but because something inside him had shifted, something fundamental. The cold predictability of boardroom tables and rooftop skyline views no longer offered the grounding he once thought they did. Instead, it was the sight of a small pink dress at the doorway, the clatter of tiny feet running to greet him, and the quiet gratitude in a sick woman's eyes that began to center his life. On Mondays, he brought groceries, bags filled with fresh fruit, cartons of milk, bags of rice, small luxuries like strawberries or yogurt with cartoon labels he imagined Ava might like. The first time he arrived with a bag of groceries, Ava had stared at him with such wide-eyed wonder it made his throat tighten. She immediately reached for the apples, clutching one to her chest like it was treasure. Behind her, a tiny voice echoed, "Apo." A sleepy-eyed boy, no more than 3, peeked out from behind a tattered blanket on the couch. This was Jamie, Ava's little brother, a detail Linda hadn't mentioned during their first meeting, likely out of instinctive protectiveness. Alexander knelt and offered the toddler an apple. Jamie took it with both hands, then leaned against his sister's leg, as if her presence was the only guarantee that the world was still safe. Ava smiled at her brother and then looked up at Alexander. "He doesn't talk much," she explained softly, "only when he's not scared." Alexander found himself nodding, though his chest ached. How much had these children seen? How much had they endured without complaint? Thursdays he brought books, colorful ones for Jamie with animals and flaps to lift, and chapter books for Ava. She would open each new one with reverence, running her fingers down the covers before carefully placing them on a shelf that was really just a row of neatly stacked milk crates in the corner. "Do you read with him?" Alexander asked one evening, watching as she balanced Jamie on her lap and pointed to the pictures in a book about trains. "Sometimes," Ava said, "but mostly I make up stories so he won't get bored." Alexander smiled. "Maybe someday you'll write your own." Her face lit up like someone had handed her a secret key to a locked world. "Really? You think I could?" "I think you already do." Saturday mornings became sweet in a new way. Alexander would stop by the little bakery 2 blocks from his penthouse, a place he'd passed 100 times and never entered. Now the owner greeted him by name, always setting aside 2 chocolate croissants and a small box of powdered donut holes. Ava's squeal the first time she saw the box made passers-by on the street turn their heads. She had twirled in place, hugging the box to her chest like it was gold. "They're for Jamie, too," she declared, careful to split the treats evenly and hand her brother the biggest donut without being asked. Alexander watched that moment unfold like a scene from a life he had never believed he'd be part of. A little girl making sure her brother ate first. A sick mother trying to sit up straighter despite the ache in her bones. And him, standing there in his $1,000 jacket, realizing none of that mattered anymore. He stopped talking about work when he visited. Instead, he listened. Linda would talk about her life before cleaning jobs, the books she used to love, how she'd wanted to be a nurse before pregnancy changed her plans. She talked about her children, about how Ava had helped rock Jamie to sleep on nights when Linda could barely lift her head. Her voice was thin, but her stories were full of heart. Alexander said little, but each word they spoke settled deep in him, like bricks in a foundation he didn't know he was building. One sunny afternoon, he arrived with a grocery bag in one hand and a small package wrapped in brown paper in the other. He had passed a downtown bookstore earlier that week, and something had caught his eye, a display of children's supplies in the window. He wasn't sure what had drawn him inside, but he came out with 2 drawing and coloring books and a new box of crayons, carefully wrapped by a kind clerk who asked, "Is this a gift?" He hadn't answered. "Not really. But now, as Ava peered up at him with wide, cautious eyes and slowly untied the brown paper to reveal the books, the joy on her face made his heart beat a little faster. "These are for me?" she whispered. He nodded. "And your brother too, if he wants." Jamie, the 3-year-old with mop-like dark curls and a quiet way of hiding behind his sister, peeked out from the hallway doorway. He was clutching a plush bear that had clearly seen better days. Alexander offered a gentle smile. "You like colors, buddy?" Jamie nodded, then ducked away shyly. Ava laughed softly, that bell-like sound he was beginning to treasure. "He's shy," she said, "but he likes trucks. I'll draw one for him." She curled up beside Alexander on the couch, the coloring book resting between them. Her small shoulder pressed lightly against his arm. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. The gesture was soft, unconscious, and spoke volumes. Alexander, whose $10,000 suits had always kept people at a distance, barely breathed. Ava opened the first page. "You can help me with this one," she said seriously, pointing to a cartoon garden filled with flowers, butterflies, and a smiling sun. She selected a pink crayon and handed it to him. "Here, you do the tulips." Alexander hesitated. The last time he held a crayon might have been in grade school, but she was waiting, so expectantly, so patiently, like it was the most normal thing in the world for a billionaire to color flowers on a page printed for children. And maybe here, in this living room that smelled faintly of lavender and tea, it was. He took the pink crayon and began shading carefully within the lines. Ava leaned closer to observe his work. "You're pretty good," she said, as if she were evaluating an apprentice. Then she smiled. "We make a good team." He looked down at the page. His flower wasn't perfect. It was a little uneven, the color too dark in one spot. But beside it, Ava's butterfly fluttered in purples and yellows, radiant and joyful. Jamie wandered over quietly, climbed onto the floor at their feet, and began drawing loops on a blank page. Ava leaned down to whisper something in his ear, and Jamie nodded solemnly. A few minutes later, he held up his page and mumbled, "Truck." It was scribbles, just lines really, but Alexander took it from him as if it were the most valuable blueprint he'd ever received. "This is amazing, Jamie," he said sincerely. The boy's eyes widened, his cheeks flushing with pride, before he retreated to curl up beside his mother, who was resting nearby, watching the scene unfold with misty eyes. They colored for over 30 minutes, not talking much, just passing crayons, giggling over which colors were too boring, and occasionally consulting Jamie for artistic direction. When the page was full, a sprawling garden with mismatched colors, half a sun, and a dinosaur sticker in the middle, Jamie's contribution, Ava sat back, surveying their work. Her lips curled into a satisfied smile. "It's perfect," she declared with the gravity of a museum curator unveiling a masterpiece. Alexander blinked. He hadn't expected to feel anything, really. Not about a coloring book page, but her declaration struck something deep. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. With pride, with certainty, with the unmistakable tone of a child who had so little but could still find joy in something small and shared. Perfect. He couldn't remember the last time someone had told him anything he did was perfect. Not his board presentations, not his quarterly reports, not even the deals that made headlines. They were impressive, aggressive, visionary, but never perfect. He looked at the page again. It was messy. The crayons had smudged. Jamie's sticker was off-center, and yet Ava's eyes were glowing with the kind of happiness he'd never been able to buy. Perfect. He cleared his throat, trying to mask the tightness there. "I think so too," he murmured. Ava beamed. Jamie yawned and crawled up beside his mother. Linda smiled faintly from her spot on the recliner. "I haven't heard them both laugh like that in weeks," she said quietly, her voice still hoarse with illness, but no longer frail with despair. "Thank you." Alexander glanced at her. There were no performance reviews here, no quarterly bonuses or contracts, but this felt like the kind of success that mattered. He turned back to Ava, who was organizing the crayons by color and humming softly. She looked up at him again. "Next time," she said, "we're going to draw a castle." Alexander smiled. You'll have to teach me how. She nodded, her curls bouncing. I will, but only if you color the roof. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden hue across the narrow apartment windows. The living room glowed with the warm light of a standing lamp, its shades slightly tilted, casting uneven shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of chamomile tea and freshly baked cornbread, a small kindness from a neighbor earlier that afternoon. Alexander sat on the edge of the faded couch, elbows resting on his knees, his suit jacket neatly folded on the armrest beside him. He had brought dinner, nothing extravagant, just hearty chicken soup and warm bread from the corner deli. But to Linda and the kids, it had been a feast. Now, Ava lay curled beside her mother on the worn recliner, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her ears still tuned to the grown-ups' voices. Alexander noticed the soft way her hand rested on Linda's forearm, her thumb absently tracing circles over the fabric of her mother's sleeve. Jamie, the youngest, had finally dozed off in a pile of pillows and blankets on the floor nearby, his tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of deep sleep. One arm still wrapped around a stuffed dinosaur that had seen better days. Linda looked tired but stronger than she had days ago. Her color had improved slightly, and the tremble in her voice wasn't as pronounced. She sipped her tea slowly, cradling the mug between both hands. Her eyes, however, weren't on the drink. They were on Alexander. You've already done so much, she said softly, breaking the silence. He looked up from where he'd been watching Jamie sleep. It's nothing, he replied gently. I just want to help. Linda offered a faint smile, the corners of her mouth trembling. That's just it. Most people say that, but then they disappear. Alexander didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of what she was trying to ask, but wasn't sure how to frame. He leaned back slightly, lacing his fingers together in his lap, and then she said it. One day you're going to stop coming, aren't you? The words weren't accusatory. They were laced with quiet resignation, a lifetime of experience in being left behind, in watching kindness fade into memory. Her voice didn't crack, but her eyes were unblinking, watching him carefully, almost bracing herself for a truth she already suspected. Alexander felt it land in his chest with a thud. He looked at her, not as a woman who worked nights scrubbing floors in a tower that bore his name, but as a mother fighting every day to stay upright for the sake of her children. No, he said finally, I won't stop, not as long as you'll let me be here. His voice wasn't loud, but the certainty in it seemed to echo through the small apartment. It silenced even the quiet creaks of the building, settling for a moment. From across the room, Ava stirred. She hadn't been asleep after all. She lifted her head from her mother's arm, her eyes glassy with drowsiness, but focused. You mean that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander turned toward her and nodded slowly. I do. The girl blinked once, then again. And that was all. No dramatic rush to his arms, no declarations, just that single question and the quiet acceptance that followed. An 8-year-old choosing to believe a man who had entered their lives like a storm, but stayed like the morning sun. Ava settled back against her mother's side, this time with a small, satisfied sigh. Her fingers reached over to brush the soft hair from Jamie's forehead. The boy stirred briefly, but didn't wake. The gesture was protective, instinctive, and it told Alexander everything he needed to know about her. She was trying to be both child and shield. Linda swallowed hard. Her hand had drifted over to Ava's hair, stroking it absently. She hasn't asked anyone that question in years, she murmured. Alexander gave a slow nod, his throat thick. He looked around the room again, the tidy chaos of a home trying to hold itself together. A stack of unpaid bills clipped together with a clothespin. Jamie's toy truck with one missing wheel. A coloring book lying open on the table where Ava had half finished a picture of a sun and 3 stick figures holding hands. He knew exactly who those figures were supposed to be. Linda set her tea down and looked at him again. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. You don't need to, Alexander replied. This isn't about thanks. I'm not doing this out of guilt or pity. I'm doing it because I care, because I want to be here. She gave a short, breathless laugh and shook her head. I've never had anyone say that to me and mean it. You do now. A silence fell between them, thick but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that settled when something real had finally been spoken aloud. Ava's eyes were closing now. She whispered, "You're staying, right?" Alexander leaned forward, resting a hand on the armrest beside her. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "I'm staying." From the pile of pillows, Jamie gave a soft sigh, rolling in his sleep. His foot landed gently against Ava's side and she shifted slightly, pressing herself closer to her brother. Alexander looked at them, two children far too young to have learned about fear and uncertainty, but who had, somehow anyway. He turned back to Linda. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I know I want to help. Not just now, not just until things get easier. I want to be part of this, of whatever this is becoming." Linda didn't speak right away, but the tears that welled in her eyes again, this time without resistance, were enough. And for the first time in a very long time, Alexander, CEO, billionaire, master of control, felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, right here, with them. The following week unfolded not with dramatic change, but with a series of small, quiet moments that began to thread Alexander's world together with that of Ava, Jamie, and Linda Reyes. Each day seemed to arrive with a subtle shift. Monday morning, he stood in his penthouse kitchen, staring at his untouched French press coffee, feeling the same dull ache he'd carried since stepping out of their apartment last Friday. That ache didn't come from stress or fatigue. It came from absence, from the sound of Ava's voice missing from his morning, from the memory of Jamie's small arms wrapped around his leg, clutching him like he was something worth holding on to. So he packed a grocery bag again. He didn't ask anyone to do it for him. He stopped at the corner market himself, choosing each item with the care of someone shopping for people he didn't just want to help, but wanted to know. Ava had mentioned her brother liked bananas, so he bought a bunch of them, perfectly yellow, not a speck of green. He added a small bag of mini marshmallows too, remembering how her eyes had lit up when she talked about making hot cocoa on special days. At the Reyes' apartment, the door opened before he even knocked. Ava was already waiting. Her cheeks dimpled as she smiled up at him. "You came." "I said I would," Alexander replied, trying to keep his voice steady as something cracked and warmed in his chest. Before he could step forward, Jamie appeared behind his sister, his thumb in his mouth. He blinked at Alexander with wide brown eyes before waddling forward and wrapping both arms around Alexander's legs. Alexander stood still, stunned by the simplicity of the gesture. He reached down and ruffled Jamie's hair gently. "Hey there, buddy. You bring snacks?" Jamie mumbled into his pants leg. Alexander chuckled. "I might have something." As he stepped inside, he felt it again. That shift, the way the room wrapped around him, the warm smell of chamomile tea, the faint hum of a TV playing cartoons in the background. Ava reached for the bag and pulled out each item with excitement, calling out to her mom in the next room. "Mom, he brought marshmallows and bananas for Jamie." From the bedroom, Linda's voice floated out, still soft, still tired, but brighter than the last time he'd heard it. "Tell him thank you, baby." Alexander stepped into the doorway to find Linda propped up on two pillows, wearing a cardigan over her pajamas. She looked stronger, still pale, but less like someone who might vanish between blinks. Her eyes met his with quiet gratitude. "I told you you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said, cutting gently through her protest. Later that afternoon, he sat on their sagging couch with Jamie asleep against his side and Ava curled next to him, flipping through a picture book. Linda sat nearby in the armchair, a soft blanket across her knees, sipping the tea he had made. They didn't talk about money or work or doctors. They talked about small things. Ava's school friends, Jamie's fear of the vacuum cleaner, Linda's old habit of listening to jazz while she cleaned, which Alexander admitted he had never really understood until now. And slowly their lives began to intertwine in ways no spreadsheet could predict. On Tuesday, he returned with fresh bread and a small bouquet of white tulips. Ava placed them in a mason jar and set them on the windowsill like it was the most valuable vase in the world. Jamie said they look like sunshine, Ava told him. Wednesday, Alexander found himself rearranging his meeting schedule just so he could stop by in time to read a bedtime story. Ava picked The Velveteen Rabbit, and as he read, her head leaned against his shoulder. Jamie nestled in her lap, both of them hanging on his every word. When he finished, Ava looked up at him. "Do you think toys can become real?" Alexander paused, caught off guard. He met her wide, hopeful eyes and whispered, "I think, when someone loves them enough, maybe anything can become real." Thursday, he came with 2 new books, one about astronauts for Ava and a pop-up book for Jamie filled with jungle animals. He stayed for dinner, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and canned soup, and it was the best meal he'd had in weeks. Friday, he walked in to find Jamie at the window, watching for him. "He's here!" Jamie squealed, racing to the door. Ava let him in with a solemn nod. "We made you something." She pulled out a folded piece of construction paper, a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. One taller with a square briefcase, one with pigtails, and one tiny with a big smile and a truck. Above them, scrawled in purple marker, it said, "Our friend Alexander." He didn't know what to say. The lump in his throat made speaking impossible. He simply bent down and hugged her, holding tight. By Saturday morning, the routine had become something he anticipated like oxygen. He brought pastries this time, fresh from a bakery 2 blocks away. Jamie smeared chocolate frosting across his cheek, and Ava picked the sprinkles off hers one by one, placing them on Alexander's plate. "You need more color in your life," she said very seriously. Alexander laughed genuinely, not the practiced boardroom chuckle he usually gave. "I think you're right." Linda watched it all from her armchair, eyes glassy but smiling. "She's never been this happy," she said softly when Ava disappeared into the bedroom to get a puzzle. "She should be," Alexander replied, barely above a whisper. "Both of them should be." That night, as the kids played with crayons on the floor and Linda leaned her head back to rest, Alexander stayed seated on the couch, feeling strangely complete. Ava glanced over at him. "You're not leaving yet, right?" He shook his head. "Not for a while." And so he stayed. Sunday came with a soft drizzle outside the apartment windows. Alexander showed up in jeans and a sweater instead of a suit, and Ava teased him that he finally looked like a normal person. He read Goodnight Moon twice because Jamie kept asking for the cow jumping part. Then they all sat on the couch, the apartment silent except for rain tapping on the window. Ava leaned her head on his arm. "You're really coming back tomorrow too?" "Yes," Alexander said without hesitation. "Tomorrow. And the day after that. As long as you want me to." She didn't answer, just closed her eyes and smiled. It wasn't grand declarations or dramatic gestures that changed their world. It was the repetition of presence, the gentle, quiet building of trust. It was marshmallows and storybooks, coloring pages and warm tea, a drawing on construction paper with 3 stick figures. For the first time in years, Alexander wasn't chasing quarterly targets. He was chasing laughter, bedtime stories, and the feeling of belonging. And their fragile world, though still full of uncertainties, had begun to glow. With hope, with family, with something real. The apartment was cloaked in a soft golden hush, the kind that only settled in homes after long days and deeper truths. Outside, the city lights flickered like distant stars. But inside the small living room, the world had narrowed to a single moment, wrapped in warmth and silence. Alexander sat on the worn couch, his arm curved protectively around Ava, who had fallen asleep nestled against his chest. Her small fingers, still faintly sticky from the jelly-filled pastry she'd devoured after dinner, rested against the lapel of his shirt. Her breath was slow and steady now, but a few minutes earlier, her voice had broken through the stillness. "You're not going to leave us, right?" The words had slipped out as she'd begun to drift off, her voice barely a whisper, fragile and uncertain, as if she wasn't quite ready to believe in the comfort she had found in him. Alexander had felt the breath catch in his chest at her question. It hadn't been a dramatic plea, just a quiet need, a child's hope wrapped in cautious fear. He hadn't answered right away. Instead, he'd looked down at her, at the tiny lines of worry that no 8-year-old should ever wear. Her face, always so brave during the day, had softened in sleep, revealing just how much she'd been carrying. Her little brother Jamie had already curled up on a cushion nearby, his thumb tucked between his lips, fast asleep beneath a threadbare blanket with faded cartoon stars. His chest rose and fell peacefully, unaware of the weight his sister had been shouldering for both of them. Alexander pressed a kiss to Ava's golden hair and whispered, "I will always be here for you, Jamie, and your mom, as long as you need me." And he meant every word. He didn't speak like a philanthropist. He didn't speak with the guarded professionalism of a CEO overseeing the corporate towers of Chicago. He spoke like a man who had finally found something he didn't know he had been missing all his life. Family. Not the one he was born into. That had been cold, distant, more about expectations than affection. Not the one he tried to build in boardrooms and balance sheets. That had given him wealth, but no peace. No, this was something entirely different. Unscripted, uncalculated, real. The soft hum of the refrigerator buzzed in the background, and from the cracked window, a cool breeze rustled the curtain. He let his eyes close briefly, allowing the rhythm of Ava's breathing and Jamie's occasional sleepy murmurs to anchor him in this moment. Linda, their mother, had fallen asleep in the reclining chair near the window, wrapped in a fleece blanket. Her breathing, though labored, had steadied. She looked better today, still pale, still weak, but her eyes earlier had carried something that hadn't been there before. Relief and something deeper. Trust. Alexander had seen it when she looked at him across the kitchen table earlier that evening. Her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea he'd made for her. She didn't thank him as profusely as she had before. Not because she was ungrateful, but because, finally, she no longer felt like she had to earn his kindness. He stayed on the couch, not moving, afraid the smallest gesture might disturb the fragile peace that had taken root here tonight. Ava stirred gently in her sleep, her cheek brushing against his chest. He ran a hand down her back, slow and comforting, like he imagined a father might. The thought both startled and steadied him. He wasn't trying to replace anyone. He didn't even know if he could call himself anything yet, but he knew that what he felt for this family was deeper than a sense of obligation. It was devotion. A sudden memory came to him, one that hadn't surfaced in years. He was 6, sitting alone on the back steps of a house that had never felt like a home. His father had missed yet another birthday. His mother had barely looked up from her phone. That cold, hollow ache in his chest. He remembered it too well. And now, holding Ava in his arms, watching Jamie sleep soundly a few feet away, he realized something. He would burn his entire empire to the ground before he let them feel that kind of loneliness. He gently shifted his weight, careful not to wake her, and let his head rest against the back of the couch. The clock on the wall ticked softly. For the first time in years, time didn't feel like an enemy. There was no urgency to be somewhere else, no pressure to prove anything. Here, on this couch, in this modest apartment, he wasn't Alexander, the powerful CEO. He was just a man who had stumbled upon the most honest connection he'd ever known. The hallway beyond the apartment door was silent now. Earlier, he'd heard a neighbor's dog barking and someone dragging a laundry basket down the stairs. But now it was just him, Ava, Jamie, and the quiet hum of love that had begun to fill this space. He glanced at the photo on the nearby shelf, one he hadn't noticed before. It showed a much healthier Linda, smiling with Ava as a toddler on her hip and baby Jamie in her arms. The picture was slightly crooked in its frame, but the joy in their eyes was unmistakable. He wondered what it had cost her to keep smiling through everything. He looked back down at Ava. Her hand twitched slightly in her sleep, and she let out a soft sigh. He smiled. It was astonishing how this little girl had changed him. Not with a speech, not with anything loud or bold, but with her quiet courage, her resilience, her love. When he first heard her voice on the phone, trembling but brave, he never could have imagined that he'd be here, weeks later, holding her in his arms, feeling more grounded than he had in a decade. Jamie stirred on the floor and let out a tiny whimper. Alexander gently eased Ava onto the couch, slid down beside the boy and pulled the blanket back over him. Jamie blinked up at him, dazed but calm. "Hey, buddy," Alexander whispered. "Go back to sleep. I'm right here." Jamie blinked again, then closed his eyes, his small hand reaching out to find Alexander's. He held it, fingers curled around Alexander's thumb, and in seconds, he was asleep again. Alexander's throat tightened. They trusted him, not because of his money, not because of his reputation, but because he stayed, and that made all the difference. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and the lingering sweetness of baked apples, Ava's favorite snack. In the corner, her coloring book lay open on the floor, a page half filled with pink and green. He'd promised her he'd help her finish it tomorrow. He would. Tomorrow, and every day after. Eventually, he stood, careful not to wake them. He adjusted the blanket over Ava and gave Jamie's shoulder a soft pat. He glanced once more at Linda, asleep under the glow of the nightlight, before stepping toward the door. His hand paused on the doorknob. He turned back. He wanted to remember this, the way the soft lamplight painted the room in gold, the way Ava's hair curled over her cheek, the way Jamie mumbled something incoherent in his dreams. He wanted to hold on to it. He opened the door slowly and stepped into the hallway. The air outside the apartment was cooler. The buzz of a flickering light bulb overhead echoed in the stairwell. But Alexander didn't feel the usual chill of stepping into the world alone. Not anymore. Because he wasn't walking away from something temporary. He was walking forward from something real. He wasn't just a visitor in their lives. He was becoming a part of them. He pulled the door shut behind him and stood in the hallway for a long moment, his back against the wood. The man who had entered this apartment weeks ago had been distant, calculating, detached. The man who stood here now was something else entirely. And for the first time in his life, Alexander didn't feel powerful because of the world he controlled. He felt powerful because of the promises he was making. He felt alive and happy because of it. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and rate this story from 10 to 100. Tell us where you're watching from too. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this touched your heart, check out more uplifting videos by clicking on the end screen now.